Yeah, first of all, I want to start with really expressing my gratitude to Martina and Hubert for giving room to the exploration of situations of refugees and asylum seekers in the CRC right from the beginning for the last 8 years. It's not a usual topic. It's a difficult one. Is preoccupying me since probably more than 20 years, so preceding the CRC. But it was an amazing opportunity to keep on working on this topic and engaging with theory making at the CRC and seeing how these interact and mutually benefit each other. So I'm dealing with a topic which is urgent and dramatic to some degree, the continuous rise of refugees globally, which have, for the first time this year ever, exceeded the number 120 million globally. Many of these, in fact, 2/3 of displaced people actually end up in cities. They do not enjoy kind of infrastructures of solidarity and care, the ones that I will critique and interrogate in my talk right now in most cities, but they're simply left as unaccounted people on streets, in cracks. So our ambition was always to set up a project that investigates these situations of forced displacement and migration at the place of asylum in societies like Germany, which have very structured kind of planned approaches, and also non-European situations. We started off in Jordan, looking at refugee camps for Syrian refugees, and now are continuing to work in Nigeria, in Lagos. So this is the kind of work that was possible by a broad team. I would like to mention Ayham Dalal, who was part of the first phase of the research, who had in fact already, he is himself Syrian, so he had cultural and personal kind of ties and also ways to infiltrate, actually really embed himself into camp situations such as those for many months preceding the CRC and then continuing in the CRC, and that made it possible to gain access to a very difficult and challenging environment, usually highly protected by UNHCR and other UN organizations, and to investigate both the humanitarian spatial orders that are designed around criteria of efficiency and universal design standards and effective help, and they are impressive structures and impressive systems that are able to help people literally overnight in the middle of nowhere due to a very sophisticated, highly calibrated systems of logistics, moving containers and tents to unlikely places. And this is the camp of Zaatari, which we looked at an early phase. And what we were interested in is how these kind of spatial orders run by humanitarian systems, which we found useful to actually characterize as kind of territorial logics, how they then turn into something very different due to a kind of disruptive actions and spatial appropriations initiated by the residents of these places, the refugee residents, who begin to move containers around, cut them apart, move them through the camp, and actually turn a very rigid kind of almost militaristic spatial order through small-scale actions and spatial agency into some very complex physical and social arrangements. And we were interested in this project how a little container cluster like that, you can just see maybe the traces of these containers in these rectilinear shapes, actually begin to reproduce forms of living together and forms of sharing spaces, semi-public spaces, sharing in this case also a shop, a reception room, and how that is beginning to hybridize the spatial knowledge brought from earlier places of living together, for instance, in a Syrian village or a small town, to these places like these camps. And materially, and our entry point into the research to understand the hybridization of spatial knowledge was always to sit, to talk, and to draw, and record, and photograph, and use the sort of material changes initiated by these residents as an entry point into discussions of hybridization of spatial knowledge. This is not the focus of my talk, I just want to give you the context, how we began to work with these spatial figures of the CRC to understand these disruptive refugee agency, rubbing and negotiating in conflictual ways with humanitarian management, who always will look at those kind of arrangements as failure to some degree, but we were able to kind of understand the complexity and multi-layeredness. My talk instead will focus on our other side, which was Berlin. Here, this is starting in 2018, 2019, we faced a situation of already declining numbers, but still a huge presence, 80, 90,000 Syrian refugees in the city. And we looked at and tried to sort of understand in a comparative way, with the question in mind, are similar logics at play? Can we also apply this kind of sensitivity that we developed towards understanding spatial practices, engaging with humanitarian orders and disrupting them, transforming them in Berlin? And indeed, early signs seem to prove similar dynamics are underway. These are early makeshift accommodation situations in Berlin gymnasium or empty buildings. And regardless how harsh this context is, there's always a sense of placemaking at work, using what is at hand, shifting beds, shifting cupboards, hanging in between spaces in order to create certain enclaves of kind of self-provisioned intimate spaces, using the material provided by the humanitarian system, engaging somehow with the harsh reality of these spaces, but beginning to transform and hybridize these spatial orders. This is a view into a refugee situation in a hangar in Tempelhof also at that time. And by now, the range of spatial typologies of accommodation has diversified. More typologies were added. And in fact, the main part of our investigation, our interest, were temple homes, which is a typology that I will now focus on. But having gotten access to Zaatari camp through the personal networks and also craftiness of Ayham Dalal as in our research team, the situation in Berlin was much more difficult. We faced a major gatekeeper, which is called the Landesamt für Flüchtlingsangelegenheiten, LAF, that had just formed at the time after a huge scandal had brought down the Lageso, a previous administration that was then exposed for corrupt practices and mismanagement, completely unable or imploding under the weight of the refugee crisis in Berlin in the mid-teens of the 10 years ago. So this new organization was coming out of, in a sense, the mess left by the previous administration, was deeply suspicious and anxious to engage with researchers. It's also a topic, as you can imagine, that had already developed signs of being over-researched by certain disciplines. So we faced a huge wall and closed doors. And it took, in fact, almost the entire first year until we began to be able to have conversations with the LAF, who is simply required to actually enter these temple homes around the city. And this characterizes our kind of ambivalent situation as a as a group of researchers here based at the TU Berlin, engaging with a very anxious, nervous bureaucracy that was keen to shield themselves of bad news, that would certainly be and was very right from the beginning of any photographic evidence or visual recordings of any kind of seeming breakdowns of their systems and orders. So our beginning of our long-term relationship, which is still continuing, was always somehow difficult and shaped by the attempt of the bureaucracy to sort of guide us and give us very selective insights only. And then, of course, being architects and planners based at the university, but for refugee residents, this does not count, doesn't make a difference. This kind of professional affiliation comes with expectations, with the expectation of accountability. Spending time with us meant we raised the expectation of actually us proposing specific changes and specific improvements to their life situations. And then, of course, we had Martina. So the CRC system, which comes with its own kind of logic of requirements for publishing and exploitation of kind of field studies, giving us this amazing opportunity, but of course also conditioning our situation. And so under these conditions, we were eventually negotiating access to 6 different temporary homes around Berlin. They were selected according to a complex set of criteria that I will not bother you with right now. And we agreed, everything had to be agreed, fixed in writing, signed off by both sides, LAF and TU Berlin, that we would apply a methodology of understanding both the institutional practices of the LAF as well as the subjective and collective spatial appropriations through visual recording and a kind of architectural ethnographic approach. So these were the humanitarian orders, or sometimes for the purpose of this talk, I maybe call them infrastructure of sort of state-managed solidarity. Container villages, such as those. At the time, they still carried the name of the previous organization, Lageso. In this case, it's a kind of 3-floor stacked container village with a central access core in a fenced-off site dotted around Berlin. And we were beginning to have limited, guided, never alone access to these sites, and were able to understand how refugees in this particular home, there were refugees from 20 different places of origin, the equal amount of languages were spoken, how simple means of spatial appropriation, like hanging a curtain on the entrance door, would be shifting furniture around, would allow refugees to live with more privacy than the designers of the LAF had imagined. And another example is the Tempo Homes, which was actually a design innovation after some critique that these 3-floor container villages don't work and create tensions with access to bathrooms, communal kitchens. So the LAF had actually, and is still very proud of having innovated another approach to housing, distributing containers on the ground in a single floor arrangement, always in units of 3, with the central container functioning as a sort of access entrance area and kitchen, and 2 sleeping arrangements on either side, and an individual bathroom at the back. The design code of the LAF comes, of course, with specifications for the containers that were sourced all over Europe, but also with precise lists of furniture and where everything hangs, and everything is standardized. Nothing can be changed, nothing can be taken out of the container, no pictures can be hung. So it's a perfectly, or it's a perfected, standardized order ready to receive refugees. And some of the rules, of course, that also structure life in a temporary home include limited access, impossibility to receive guests. They are managing sort of daily routines at the camp in multiple ways. Again, here through our work of visual recording and sitting and having tea and conversations and meals and coming back again, we were able to somehow understand how under these harsh and very structured conditions, nevertheless, residents were able to explore the maneuvering space to initiate little changes, which included, for instance, shifting furniture around, getting rid of the table, turning it upside down, initiating a small garden, rearranging kind of the way everyday life was organized inside. And just some examples, for instance, of sitting together and eating as a family, moving furniture around to respond more to kind of traditions of using spaces flexibly and through multiple uses during the day. I won't have time to go into too much detail, just want you to enjoy these examples of very diverse, very individually organized and decorated rooms. At all times, rules had to be bent, rules had to be challenged, and negotiated to make this possible. Another example are the addition of new furniture not allowed by law. You see here also a quite ingenious beginning. Actually, in later it amplified the kind of tendency to reconvert this porch that was added by the LRF at some point into an additional private space or semi-private space, adding gardens, and always at all times kind of organizing ways of visual protection and from outside views, from the views of management or other neighbors. And another example is working around the limitation of not being able to put a nail in the wall or hang anything on the wall. Refugees actually began to use spoons and knives and forks, yank them into cracks to create a kind of fixing system. And we were able to actually trace the origins and how this knowledge of initiating these little changes traveled with refugees across different sites on the asylum journey, but also between camps. Yeah, and this garden is maybe one of the most kind of disturbing examples of how an initiative of a resident who had a big garden in Syria and wanted to recreate and re-engage in this kind of practice, how that was consistently sort of running against bureaucratic rules of fire protection, and it had to move several times around the camp during the year. Common rooms as perceived and as used. Interestingly, these camps were organized as housing-only arrangements, but we found everywhere initiatives like entrepreneurial initiatives, cooperatives forming around hairdressing, around working together with certain textile work, seamstresses, etc., infiltrating these kind of spaces and somehow bringing them to life, but in the shadow or being at best tolerated by the camp management. And a final example, how very proudly the LRF had initiated another design innovation, a very costly one, to invest in public spaces between containers, again following cycles of critique and feedback from refugees, and created somehow very clean, very empty arrangements, hugely costly, and simply wondering why are they not being used or at best used to hang their washing. So it's very, very interesting to see this kind of clashing rationalities of a design ambition to actually generally improve the situation of the camp, but failing to really speak to and understand the needs of refugees who would never dream of sitting here together, exposed to the views of the entire camp, but found very different places to meet. So I have to race a bit because some of my key points are still coming. This led to this publication and a constant kind of difficult dialogue with the administration, in which we try to give visibility and provide understanding of these small-scale kind of actions as being driven by the wish for self-dignity, self-provisioning. Also, we were able to explain why they come from and why they initiated it and why they're not design failures or breakdown of orders. But even the publication of small pictures was an intense, painstaking kind of negotiation, because the LRF was worried of being exposed as kind of having lost control. So constantly these clashing kind of rationalities between homemaking and the obligation to guarantee safety and fire protection, and this is obviously the focus of our discussion, the genuine attempt of in-house design teams within the LRF to learn and to improve, going through intensely bureaucratic hoops and cycles of getting that through, getting funding, changing the standard, learning, and then the reality of failing again, because we see in Berlin not really a substantive kind of rethinking of refugee homes. In fact, the city is now commissioning 6 new container villages around Berlin, and still runs this huge kind of reception center, reproducing again and again the same spaces. And in a, of course, increasingly difficult political context. So I'm trying to kind of bring this back now to a broader understanding of how how in a kind of Western liberal democracy like Germany, we are trying to organize kind of solidarity. So I think we have grown used to mandate the state to technocratically organize places of arrival, protection, programs for inclusion, pathways to integration. And our work helped me and helped us to understand the ambivalence of kind of care and control that characterizes these sort of techno-managerial infrastructures of care. Nevertheless, can we imagine a state like Germany, a Western liberal democracy, not paying for refugees, not allowing asylum seekers to live in a safe home when they arrive after a traumatic journey? I think not. So it is, we expose the kind of complexity and the ambivalence, but at the same time, with these kind of infrastructures of care becoming more and more under pressure from populist parties, although the numbers are dropping at the moment, the political space is dominated by discussions around migration. I think we urgently need to rethink these kind of state-run provisionings. And likewise, there is there's another side. It is incomplete. It produces exclusions, problematic hierarchies, power dynamics. So there is another side, which for me, these informal appropriations are part of, which is more informal practices of solidarity, which are much faster, more flexible. They're inconvenient. They're against rules. They often lead to alliances between also refugees and civil society. And I want to show some of them. We ourselves, as a research team, we're engaging in certain actions in camps, for instance, building public furniture as alternatives for public spaces, or rethinking open spaces in camps, or in fact, this was preceding the CRC, but organizing a kind of residence, a local residence refugee joint kitchen hub. This is work of my colleague from the Habitat unit, Moritz Ahlert, as part of another research project, Transforming Solidarities. sort of engaging in an architectural practice that I think tries to not only advise the bureaucracy and try to fight through reforms, but also engages in other forms of alliances in civil society, in this case refugees, to form and professionalize and expose and work with these informal practices. And around Germany, there are many, many examples where these, almost done, where these practices have led to very impressive results. Just Grand Hotel Cosmopolis in Augsburg or La Bellevue di Monaco are just examples. Our own work with Ben Sababarani is a researcher now joined Ben, is also present here, where the city was responding to these bottom-up pressures to understand that they had to actually do more than just provide camps and engaged in a sort of neighborhood improvement scheme that we were also ourselves through teaching programs and our research helping to engage in a sense. And this is another example where we did similar things in Cairo, leading to small-scale kind of co-produced infrastructure that can never be mediated and meditated and implemented by state, but needs to come out of different processes. So these sort of dialogue between spatial material infrastructure of care that create roles and mandates for states and larger humanitarian organizations, and these informal practices of solidarity, I think are both necessary and mutually synergistic, and both sides offer and require actually the role and engagement of architects and planners. So I think it's both. We can discuss this further in our discussion, and I'll end here now because I'm already over time. Thanks.